The wind howled across the Wyoming plains, scattering dry snow against the fences and rattling the tin roof of the old homestead. Inside, Thomas Kellen sat by the stove, a wool blanket around his shoulders and his newborn son cradled in his arms. The baby's tiny mouth opened in a weak cry, the sound too fragile for the vast silence of the house. It was the only sound that had kept him company for the last 2 days. Mary had been gone less than a week. She'd gone into labor too early, her body too tired, the winter too cruel. The midwife from the neighboring town had come, done her best, but the blood hadn't stopped. When the crying of the baby had first filled the room, Thomas had felt a rush of joy, only for it to break against the wave of loss when he realized Mary was gone. Now he sat, hollow-eyed, the baby pressing against his chest in hunger he couldn't satisfy. The milk Mary had saved in bottles was gone. The cow had dried up. And Thomas, though he had fed cattle all his life, had no idea how to feed something so small and helpless. He'd tried to mix cornmeal with water, tried to spoon it into the baby's mouth, but it only made the child cough and cry harder. He had thought about riding into town, but the storm had rolled in that morning, cutting off the road with drifts of snow. So he waited. He didn't know what for, maybe a miracle, maybe an end to both their suffering. By evening, when the light outside turned blue and the fire was almost dead, a sound rose above the wind. A horse. Then the steady, unmistakable rhythm of boots on the porch. Thomas rose stiffly, the baby still in his arms. He opened the door. A woman stood there, snow clinging to her coat and hat. She was broad-shouldered, wrapped in wool and fur, with eyes that looked at him not with pity but with purpose. "Thomas Kellen?" she asked, her breath misting in the cold air. He nodded, too tired to speak. "I'm Clara Dunn," she said. "From the Simmons Ranch, 5 miles east. Your wife sent word for me before." She hesitated, her eyes softening. "Before she passed." Thomas blinked, confused. "Sent word for you. She said you'd need help. Said you'd have a little one coming soon." She stepped inside before he could answer, brushing snow from her coat. When her gaze fell on the baby, who had started crying again, she took off her gloves slowly. "May I?" she asked. Thomas hesitated. He hadn't let anyone touch the child since Mary died. But something in the woman's tone, gentle, steady, sure, made him nod. Clara lifted the baby, tucking him close against her chest. She unbuttoned her coat, revealing a thick wool sweater beneath, and cradled the baby near the warmth of her body. The child's crying softened almost immediately, his small fists unclenching. "I have a little one myself," she said softly. "Born 3 months ago. He's with my sister now. I can feed yours until the storm passes." Thomas stared, realization dawning. He turned away quickly, his throat tightening. "You'd do that. For us." "For her," Clara said. "Mary was kind to me once. I owe her that much." She didn't say more, and he didn't ask. But something eased inside him as she sat near the fire, rocking the baby gently until his cries turned to small, contented sighs. When the child was asleep, Thomas added wood to the stove and poured coffee for them both. The silence that filled the room was no longer unbearable. Clara stayed through the night. The storm raged outside, but the small house held its warmth. She fed the baby twice, humming low tunes that Thomas half recognized from old church hymns. Each time she handed the child back, he slept a little longer, his breathing even. By morning, the world outside was buried in white. The fences were gone beneath the snow, and the path to the barn was nothing but a wind-sculpted ridge. Clara looked out the window and shook her head. "You won't be going anywhere for a while." Thomas almost smiled. Looks that way. He tried to thank her, but she waved it off. You've got enough to do, she said. I'll tend to the fire and the baby. You see to the animals before they freeze. And so the days began to find their rhythm. Thomas would go out before dawn, breaking ice from the water troughs and pitching hay to the cattle. He worked with a kind of numb precision, his grief buried under the repetition of chores. When he came in, Clara would be sitting by the stove, the baby in her arms, her face glowing with the warmth of the fire. She cooked simple meals, biscuits, beans, coffee strong enough to keep them both upright, and filled the house with the smells of life again. Sometimes she'd talk while she worked, about her sister, about her little boy named Henry, about the ranch she'd grown up on. Her husband had died the previous spring, trampled by a bull that had gone wild during branding. She told it without drama, only the quiet weight of someone who had already carried too much loss. One night, when the wind had finally stilled, Thomas found her sitting on the porch, the baby asleep inside. The stars were bright, scattered thick across the black sky. You're a brave woman, he said quietly. Clara chuckled. No, I'm just stubborn. Same as you. He looked at her profile against the night, the lines of her face, the calm in her posture. She wasn't beautiful in the delicate way Mary had been, but there was a strength in her, a steadiness that made him want to breathe again. I don't know how to thank you, he said. You don't need to, she replied. Just keep living. That was harder than she made it sound. But little by little, he did. When the snow began to melt, and the first patches of brown earth showed through, Clara prepared to leave. She had her own son waiting for her, and the roads were finally open. Thomas felt the loss coming before she said a word. I'll ride home tomorrow, she said quietly one morning. You'll be all right now. He nodded, though the word felt hollow. You've done more than I can repay. She looked at him, her eyes soft. You'll repay it by being a father. That's all that matters. That night, after she'd fed the baby one last time, Thomas held the child himself for a long while. The baby's face, round and calm, reminded him of Mary. But when he looked into his son's eyes, he no longer saw only loss, he saw a reason to keep going. Clara left at dawn. The sound of her horse faded into the hills, leaving behind a silence that felt different now, not empty, but full of memory. Weeks passed. The grass began to grow again, the calves were born, and the rhythm of ranch life returned. But Thomas couldn't shake the thought of her, the woman who had arrived through a storm and kept them both alive. He wrote her a letter, careful with his words. He thanked her for her kindness, told her the baby was growing strong, and asked if she might come visit when the summer came. Her reply came a month later. The handwriting was neat and sure. Henry and I would love to visit. We owe you a fence or two, after all. It was enough to make him smile again. When she returned in July, the valley was green, the air warm. She rode up the path with her son on a small pony beside her. Thomas's boy, now chubby and laughing, reached out from his father's arms when he saw them. Clara dismounted, her face breaking into a grin. He's gotten big. Too big for one man to keep up with, Thomas said. Good thing you came back. She laughed, the sound light as the summer wind. They spent the afternoon mending fences and talking, about small things at first. Then about everything they'd both carried. When the sun set behind the ridge, painting the fields gold, Thomas realized something had changed. The ache that had haunted him since Mary's death was still there, but softer now, filled with gratitude instead of sorrow. He looked at Clara and saw not just the woman who had saved his son, but someone who had found her own way through the darkness, same as him. Over the following months, she came often. Sometimes with her boy, sometimes alone. The two children played together in the yard, their laughter echoing against the barn walls. By autumn, when the leaves turned to copper and the nights grew cold again, Clara was part of the ranch. She and Thomas worked side by side, fixing what winter had broken and preparing for what would come. One evening, after supper, they sat on the porch watching the stars return. "I used to think life ended with loss," Thomas said quietly. "That after Mary, there was nothing left worth holding onto." Clara didn't speak. She reached over, taking his hand in hers. Her touch was warm, steady. "Maybe it's not about holding on," she said finally. "Maybe it's about finding something new to carry forward." He turned to her then, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel the weight of loneliness pressing down. The world was still hard, still unforgiving, but it was also wide, and in that moment, full of possibility. The ranch grew quieter that winter. The children learned to walk, their laughter the heart of the house. Thomas still rode the pastures each day, still mended fences, still felt the ache of loss when he saw the hills Mary had loved, but now there was another presence waiting for him by the fire, another heartbeat beside his. Clara never tried to replace what he had lost. She brought her own story, her own strength, and in time, their lives wove together like two threads that had long been meant to meet. Years later, when people spoke of the Kellen Ranch, they told the story of the winter when the storm had buried the valley, when a man nearly lost everything, and a woman rode through the snow to save a crying child. They said it was a miracle. But Thomas knew better. It wasn't a miracle, it was mercy. The kind that comes not from heaven, but from one heart to another, when the world seems darkest and the door opens anyway. And every evening, when the wind rose again across the plains, he'd hold his son close, watch Clara moving through the house, and remember the night she had knocked, bringing not just milk for a hungry baby, but the warmth that had saved them both.